So I saw this clip of Max Verstappen the other day.
Do you like front-wheel drive?
No, I think it's really boring.
Yeah, we call it wrong-wheel drive.
Yeah, it's really boring. For me, it's just like anti-driving. You know, it's like it's the worst thing ever.
Now, judging by the comments when this video hit social media, that triggered a lot of people. But that's not just Max trolling, you know.
Right now, we've got probably a generation of young people that have never driven a rear-wheel drive car. And as we know, as enthusiasts, it's a completely different experience from driving a front-wheel drive car.
That's Gordon Murray, the guy who designed the McLaren F1. Christian von Koenigsegg agrees, so does Mate Rimac, John Hennessy, the biggest names in the performance car industry. And Gordon's not wrong about that generation, you know. Walk through any car lot today, out of 100 brand new cars, only 9 send power to the rear wheels. 9. So, what's the deal? Why do these legends call rear-wheel drive the right way, while the rest of the world is driving the other way? So I've got 2 cars here to find out. One that represents how most people drive, and one that represents how cars were meant to be driven. And why do I say that? Well, because in the early days of the automobile, every car was rear-wheel drive. Not because engineers were trying to make them more fun, but because this little guy didn't exist yet. The CV joint. You see, before this, you literally couldn't send power to the front wheels and steer at the same time. So, rear-wheel drive wasn't a choice, you know, it was just physics. Well, mostly. Some early cars did have front-wheel drive, but they literally turned the entire front end, engine and all, with the wheels. It worked, you know, but once cars got actual bodywork, you know, fenders, proper shape, that trick stopped working. Some tried with U-joints, but those turned out not to be that effective. But here's where it gets interesting. The first person to make front-wheel drive work was the 23-year-old Ferdinand Porsche. Yeah, that Porsche. In 1897, he designed an electric car, motors built right into the front wheels. You see, no engine, no transmission, just turn the wheel and go. Pretty simple, right? Except electric cars died for like 120 years, so back to the rear-wheel drive we went. But engineers being engineers, they never gave up. And 28 years later, front-wheel drive showed up in the most unexpected place, the racetrack. The Miller 122 was a front-wheel drive Indy car from 1925. It used early CV joints, cramped everything in the nose, and it was insanely low. And then naturally, you know, someone thought, why not put this into a street car? And then we got the Cord L29. First front-wheel drive production car in America and the first in the world to use real CV joints. It was a luxury car. It had a super long hood, low stance, and proper gangster vibes. You know, you could thank front-wheel drive for that look. But it was pretty heavy, slower than the competition. Then the Great Depression hit, and that was pretty much it. So technically, you know, front-wheel drive as we know it today started with racing, luxury, and Porsche. Kind of funny how that works, huh? Anyway, the real game changer came in 1934 with the Citroën Traction Avant, which literally means front-wheel drive in French. It was light, affordable, and actually sold pretty well. But to be honest, you know, none of that really mattered until 1959. This tiny British box is the reason why everyone drives front-wheel drive today. The original Mini. It was born in the middle of a fuel crisis, designed to be tiny, efficient, and practical for everyone. The engineers put the whole drivetrain up front and left the rest of the space for people. Small car, big interior, and super light. Then racing driver John Cooper got behind the wheel and realized that this little fuel saver actually handled brilliantly. That's when the world saw that front-wheel drive could be practical, affordable, and genuinely fun. You know, within 6 years, they made 1 million of them. And when the Italian Job hit cinemas in 1969, starring Michael Caine, Mini's popularity went full rock star. But at that time, rear-wheel drive was still the king. You know, it was everywhere, in America and Europe. But not for long, because in the 70s, oil crisis hit. All over the world. You know, fuel prices exploded and every manufacturer remembered what Mini did. So they did the same. Entire established models switched from rear-wheel drive to front-wheel drive almost overnight. Cadet in 79, Escort in 1980, Sunny in 81, Corolla in 83, even Bluebird and Camry. Later the big American stuff followed. Chrysler LeBaron in 82, Cadillac DeVille in 85, Buick LeSabre and Oldsmobile 88 in 86, and more and more. You see, in barely a decade, rear-wheel drive went from how every car is built to something special. And that's where we are now. Front-wheel drive won on space, cost, and efficiency. But that's not what Max Verstappen meant when he called it anti-driving. right? That's about fuel. And fuel comes from how a car is put together. This is my 2001 BMW E46 330 Ci. Rear-wheel drive, of course. And in 2025, it's not exactly what you'd call normal anymore. But it's a textbook example of the layout enthusiasts love. And like in most rear-wheel drive cars, the engine sits longitudinally, meaning front to back. Behind it, the transmission. Then a drive shaft running down the middle to a rear differential, which splits power between the two wheels. That's a lot of pieces, and it's definitely not the most efficient way to get the power from point A to point B. It also adds complexity, weight, and cost. It also means you've got this tunnel running through the center of the car, eating up legroom. Drive sheds underneath here. But the upside is huge. Because the engine's in the front and the power goes to the back, the whole car has to be balanced. You can't just make it nose heavy. Otherwise, rear end would have no grip and you'd be sliding all over the place. That's why rear-wheel drive cars usually have better weight distribution, which translates to more neutral handling, more predictable traction, especially when you're on the throttle, and when you push it hard, you can actually use the throttle to rotate the car. That's oversteer. And in the right hands, it's fun and fast. In the wrong hands, well, you've seen the memes. But the most important part is this. In performance driving scenarios, rear-wheel drive is better for tires because they share the load. The front wheels only steer and brake, and the rear wheels do the pushing. Plus, when you get on the throttle, the whole car squats back, and it pushes those rear wheels down into the ground. More grip right when you need it the most. And when it comes to maintenance, there is more stuff to break and service. Drive shaft, rear diff, mounts, plus bushings and bearings in between everything. But when something does need fixing, it's usually very easy to get to. Now, if I lived in a perfect world, a brand new Honda Civic Type R would be sitting here. But that's all I could get, a Renault Clio. And honestly, that kind of proves something, because that's the reality for most people. They're everywhere, and for a good reason. And like in most front-wheel drive cars, the engine sits transversely, meaning sideways. The engine, gearbox and differential live in one compact unit up front, with two short half sheds powering the front wheels. The wins are pretty obvious. First, packaging. No long transmission, no drive shaft, no rear diff. You get a flatter floor and way more cabin space in the same footprint. Well, to be fair, most modern front-wheel drive cars still have that drive shaft tunnel. Because either they share platforms with all-wheel drive models, or, like this Clio, the exhaust is underneath here. And it also adds some structural rigidity to the entire chassis, so that's always nice. Second, weight and cost. Fewer big parts, fewer spinning parts, which means less power gets lost on its way to the wheels. So with the same engine, you'll actually get a little bit more horsepower than you would in a rear-wheel drive car. And that makes it more fuel efficient too. Plus, it's lighter overall, cheaper to build, and cheaper to buy. Third, everyday traction. And what do I mean by that? Well, because the engine's up front and it's pushing down on the front tires, that means the front tires, driven tires, have more weight on them in terms of weight distribution than the rear-wheel drive. And that really helps in rain and snow, especially when moving slowly. Now, with proper tires, both layouts actually work pretty well. Front-wheel drive just feels safer for most people, but if you know what you're doing, rear-wheel drive can give you more traction and more control, if you know what you're doing, But for most people, front-wheel drive is safer and more easy. And maintenance on this? Well, there's fewer parts, which means fewer parts to break and service, but once something does break, everything's so tightly packed together that it's usually harder to get to it. Anyway, here's the thing that makes front-wheel drive a bit weird. These front tires, they have to do everything. They have to steer the car, stop the car, and put the power down. And those guys back there, they're just, there, just along for the ride. That's why when your front tires get cooked, you just swap them with the rears and you're good for another 2 years. And that's good for keeping the expenses down, but when you push this thing hard through corners, those front tires will get overwhelmed fast. The car just goes straight instead of turning, that's understeer. Add torque and you will get that torque steer that everyone talks about, where the steering wheel will pull to one side because the axles usually aren't the same length. And since all the power is going through the front tires, they're constantly fighting each other for grip. Not to mention the fact that when you accelerate, the car also squats down like a rear-wheel drive car. But instead of pushing down on the driven tires, it kind of lifts weight off them. Physics is always kind of working against you. And this is where Max's comments start to make a little bit more sense, anti-driving. It's just the fact that this layout prioritizes efficiency and packaging over handling purity, you know? Now, front-wheel drive can be fun and fast. The Mini handled it brilliantly, you know, because it was tiny and light. Even Lotus knew it. When they developed the front-wheel drive Elan in the late 80s, their own testing showed that for the same weight, power and tires, a front-wheel drive version was actually faster over the same section of the road. Better traction, better controllability, and all those front-wheel drive quirks, you know, like torque steer, were not that big of a deal. So, you know, if Lotus can make a good front-wheel drive car, you know that it's not all anti-driving. But here's the thing, you know, front-wheel drive works until you up the power. For example, like shoving a big V8 over the front wheels. This is where stuff will, you know, go wrong. That's why you don't often see, you know, street front-wheel drive cars with more than, I don't know, 300 horsepower without going all-wheel drive or adding some serious engineering magic. However, you know, modern front-wheel drive has evolved. Limited slip diffs, special suspensions, equal-length shafts, torque vectoring, you know, and when all that's dialed in, a good front-wheel drive car can actually feel way better, much more quicker than a badly set up rear-wheel drive car, you know, of course. Still, physics is physics, you know, one axle doing everything versus two axles sharing the work. But that's all on paper, you know, specs, layout, packaging, it's all theory, until you drive them. So, let's drive them. Okay, right now I'm in a Clio, and unfortunately I cannot turn the safety systems off, which is a shame. But this Clio is fun, man. I didn't expect that. It's super light, super nimble. The steering is very light, you can feel everything through it, surprisingly. Now let's see if we can find the limit on this little guy, which shouldn't be too difficult. And you know I'm crazy for comparing this to the E46, but after driving it for a couple of minutes now, maybe I'm not that crazy. I mean, this is a modern car, after all. Okay, not bad, not bad. You see, that initial turn-in was pretty good. Probably due to all that weight up front helps with initial turn-in. Like here. Okay, okay. Uh-huh. Ah, there it is. There it is. Classic understeer. Let's see if I can overcome this. Yeah, no, Okay, okay, okay. Yeah, it's not gonna let me push more. Unfortunately, this is it for this guy. But yeah, you know, more than just the understeer, it's interesting how the understeer develops. You turn in and it turns in pretty good actually, but then it's like an on-off switch. Okay, turn in is good, but there it is, you know. Let's see if I let off the throttle. Yeah, ooh, You see that? Once I let out the throttle, I shifted the weight up front and the car just turned. And this is way more noticeable on a front-wheel drive car than a rear-wheel drive car, I think. We're gonna see that later. Okay, okay. Yeah, once you let out the throttle mid-corner, the car is just gonna rotate, and that's... Yeah, okay. Interesting. Let's see here. On the throttle, off. Yeah, this is fun, man. This is fun. It's pretty easy to modulate that weight transfer. Let's see if I go no throttle in the corner. Oof. Nice. Okay, so there's so there's basically zero understeer off throttle in this car. I honestly thought this car is gonna understeer even off throttle, but apparently it doesn't. Interesting, interesting. It's probably because of its weight and I don't know, because it's French. There's a little bit of torque steer, but not that much because it's not that powerful. You know, in cars like this, torque steer is not really noticeable. You can feel the front wheels, you know, fighting for grip, but that's okay. Whew. Yeah, this car just wants to rotate. It's actually pretty fun. So, and, you know, that just proves my point. I'm glad we did this road test because it's not all black and white, you know. What about this roundabout? Oof. It's pretty fun. Oof. Okay, a lot of grip, So basically, you know, you just have to adapt your driving style to the layout and you'll be okay. You can have a lot of fun with both chassis. Okay. Not bad, actually. Holy shit. They just pulled me straight out of a corner. But yeah, this is where front-wheel drive starts to feel a bit weird. Once you go full throttle, you know, everywhere in a corner, then the understeer is real. So basically, off throttle, it behaves pretty similarly to rear-wheel drive, to my BMW actually, and I'm really surprised about that, to be honest. But the difference shows up immediately when you know, hit the gas, when you put the power down. That's where front-wheel drive, you know, starts to struggle a little bit. And it just, you know, due to the fact that the front tires are doing everything, you know, doing too much. They can't handle it. So, but that's pretty obvious, right? But I definitely wouldn't say it's anti-driving like Max said. I don't know. I mean, this is a freaking Renault Clio, little 3-cylinder turbo, and you know, I'm struggling to find the limit. And when I do, it's pretty fun. I don't know why that would stop anybody from, you know, buying a front-wheel drive car. But I guess we're gonna find that out later when I drive my E46. Because honestly, I have forgotten how the rear-wheel drive feels. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, you know, right off the bat, you can feel that this car is rear-wheel drive. I mean, obviously, I know that sounds stupid, but getting into this car straight from that Clio really just, you know, amplifies those differences. And when I say that this feels like a rear-wheel drive car, you know, more than just how the car behaves, I mean how it feels. You know, it's about the feel. You can literally feel the power going to the rear wheels as you punch the throttle. You know, you can feel that through your butt and hips. You know, it just kind of pushes you, like, you know. Whoa. Let's see how the limit feels like in this car. See, there it is. That's the difference. Once you know, start to understeer, you can just power out. Let's see here. See that? Yeah. Overcome this. Yeah, no, Okay. Overcome
Let's see
this.
here.
Yeah, no, see that? Yeah. Okay. You know, I don't think I could show it any more clearly than that. You know, the main difference is really that in a rear-wheel drive car, you have two options what to do when you start to understeer in a corner. You can either let off the gas, like in a front-wheel drive car, or you can add gas, you know, and you can just overcome that understeer like that. Yeah, there's not so much initial turn-in as on the Clio, but okay, that's due to the rack, I guess. Also weight distribution, I guess. But this feels way more secure. Yeah. Slight understeer, but then easily corrected. The f was that? See? Yeah, okay. I mean, okay, now it's pretty clear. Now it's pretty clear also for me. The feel is what matters to me the most, you know. In a front-wheel drive car, you know, I feel like I'm Santa Claus. You know, Santa, like riding his sleigh with a reindeer pulling him, you know, he's like that. Yeah, front-wheel drive kind of feels like that, you know, because when you're on the throttle, like in the corner, it just feels like the steering wheel is literally pulling you, right? But on this car, it kind of feels like riding a horse, you know, because you feel you feel the rear end through your hips and butt. You know, I've never ridden a horse, but I can imagine it feels like that, I guess. I don't know, maybe I'm just stupid. But let's try those high-speed corners. where Clio clearly rotated. Yeah, you know, you can rotate this car with throttle. You cannot do that in a front-wheel drive car. This is basically the main difference. And on the front end, the front tires, the steering wheel always feels free. You know, it's not that much going on in front, except for, you know, turning. Let's see if this car can rotate off throttle the same way as Clio does. Yeah, of course it does. Okay, so yeah, just to confirm, off throttle into a corner, both layouts act pretty similarly, you know. The only difference I can feel off throttle is the weight distribution. You know, you can feel it spread out more evenly. I don't know if I'm making this up because I know the fact, but if I try to find some differences, I think it's in the weight distribution, you know. This just feels more predictable in a way. You know, when I go into a corner, I don't feel like I'm following the car. I feel like I'm in the car. Because I am. But I hope you know what I mean. Yeah, a little bit. I guess aggressive input at slow speeds. That's where rear-wheel drive kind of understeers. Now, I experienced understeer on this car a couple of times, and usually it was mid-corner, some throttle. Yeah, but as you can see, you get initial understeer and then you transition right into the oversteer. And in Clio, it's kind of the opposite. You get initial rotation and then more understeer. Where in this car you get, I'm not sure if you get understeer, but you know, disclaimer, this is a BMW at the end of the day. You know, if this were I don't know, some 60s American muscle car, or like a, you know, Ford Crown Vic, things would look a bit different, you know, so keep that in mind. That's a tough one, to be honest, you know, because once you get the Clio to rotate, it's super satisfying. And you know, in this car, it's just obvious that it's gonna do that. So I know it's not fair to compare the Clio to the BMW. I know, you know, I know that, okay? But if I were in a Civic Type R, for example, you know, the limits would be way higher, obviously. Also, the car would probably act a bit differently. But like I said before, you know, physics is physics. You cannot work around that. I mean, front-wheel drive cars do work around that, but also, just so you know, rear-wheel drive is also not just one thing. There's front engine rear-wheel drive like this car. There's front mid engine, rear mid engine, and then rear engine, and all of these layouts have different characteristics, you know, different driving feel, different handling characteristics. But this is just the layout that most people know, that is the most accessible. In the end, you know, it's not about which is better, it's just that these are two completely different conversations you can have with a machine. The man and the machine. And that's what it's all about, to be honest, because I drive cars for fun, not to chase lap times, you know. It's not about performance, it's just about having fun with the car, and you can have fun in both cars. So here's how I see it. Max calls front-wheel drive anti-driving because from an engineering perspective, it was never designed for performance or driving enjoyment. But it makes sense for most cars. More space, cheaper, lighter, easy in bad weather, you know. And honestly, for the same price, you can get a faster, cheaper front-wheel drive hot hatch than the most boring rear-wheel drive sedan. That's where front-wheel drive is good. And Gordon says a generation of young people have never experienced rear-wheel drive because, you know, once you do, you understand there's a whole other dimension to how a car can move and respond. But here's the thing, we've kind of gone full circle. You know, we started with rear-wheel drive because it was the only thing that worked, then front-wheel drive took over because it made the most sense for most people, and now EVs can actually put electric motors anywhere, and guess what? A lot of them are going back to rear-wheel drive because, you know, for the same reasons as before. Better balance, more natural steering, tires sharing the load, and, you know, the biggest one, rear-wheel drive just handles more power better. It's funny, you know, technology freed us from the old limitations, and we ended up choosing the same thing as, you know, the first thing, kinda. That should probably tell you something. Let me know which layout you prefer and why. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps me out a lot. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.